All right, so I guess we can slowly start. I am happy to welcome you to our joint lecture series. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Sven Apel. Sven is with us for roughly 1.5 years now, I think, at Saarland University. He is professor for computer science / software engineering there. His academic career started at the University of Magdeburg, where he got a summa cum laude PhD once upon a time. He also spent some time at the University of Waterloo, and then much of his career went on in Passau at the University of Passau, which is a well-known place for software engineering people. Remember that also Andreas Zeller was there before being hired by us. And he was there first with an Emmy Noether Nachwuchsgruppe, and later with a Heisenberg Fellowship. So he has been, let's say, well supported by German well-respected funding. And as I say, since about a year or 1.5 years, he's full professor now with us. I think he's one of the greatest hire that we could make. If you look at the Google Scholar profiles that mention Saarland University, he is number 4 now. And I think he climbed up by 10 in this ranking in the last year. So his gradient is very steep. And one of the things he does is trying to understand what the brain has to do with the programmer. And he will tell us much more about this today. Sven?
Okay, thank you, Holger. That was very kind. Yeah, it's my pleasure to talk about one area of research that I'm interested in. So I follow that area or that line of research for about a decade with students and colleagues from other universities and institutions. So it's about program comprehension, and the most important asset is the programmer, who's still an unknown being in that area. And the subtitle of the talk contains the term Neuroage, which does not refer to artificial neural networks and deep learning and so on, but it refers to the set of techniques and methods that have been developed to measure and image processes and neural activity in the human brain, in order to make sense of the cognitive processes that take place in the human mind, including the programmer. So here's this well-known statement: software is eating the world, and I think it's not to be debated here that this is true. The point is that that also makes programming as a task or activity very important. Right? So programming is important. It's getting even more important as now more and more so-called non-traditional programmers or non-trained programmers start programming in Python and so on. Right? So it's very important. And programming is a complex task. So the software we build is incredibly complex, but also the tools we use, programming languages, compilers, and so on, are very complex. And most work in that area in computer science, or the part that is concerned with programming, tries to solve this problem, the complexity problem, from a technical point of view, right? So we develop program analysis tools, integrated development environments, programming languages, and so on. But the point is, and also the question is that only a technical problem, right? And in our community, we always use this headline here, this news from BBC on the loss of the Mars Climate Orbiter spacecraft, which was due to a software problem, right? And if you look into this, you see that was due to the team structure. So let's look at the bottom part, right? So the software structure from a really high level point of view is we have a control component, a measurement component, and there's data between. And the point is that these two components or subsystems have been developed by two different teams, one team at NASA and one team at Lockheed Martin. And implicitly, the NASA people assumed the use of imperial units like inch and so on. And the Lockheed team computed with metric units like centimeters. And that led to miscalculations and in the end to the loss of that climate orbiter. The lesson here is really that here the problem was really a comprehension and coordination problem that led to the loss. Really is in the end also a communication problem. So it's not only a technical problem. That's what commonly is called the human factor in programming or software engineering. And the observation is clear: software is made by humans for humans, right? Which is also related to HCI and so on. And recently I stumbled over this this quote from Don Knuth, who states basically that when we do programming, we need to think more in terms of how to communicate with other programmers and the user instead of trying to be very technical and talking effectively to the computer. So okay, program comprehension is so that's also part of the title, right? And it's a very important task. So if you look at it, and here that's some numbers from a study, how much of the activity during software development is dedicated to individual tasks. You see that the task of making sense of a program while looking at the code from others or your own code is really taking up a major share, right? So program comprehension is very important. And as such, we want to measure it, right? And the basic reason, I think it's clear, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So as is also shown in that quote from the economist Drucker, right? But there are also other reasons why we would like to measure program comprehension, right? So, for example, a couple of major companies and also major open source projects have these coding style guidelines. And that's very important to them that you follow these guidelines, because the hypothesis is if you follow the guideline, then the quality of the software is better, right? So you have less bugs and it's easier to maintain and to extend and to adapt and so on. The point is that mostly these guidelines talk about comprehension. The argument is if you follow these guidelines, then the code is easier to comprehend, and that means that you introduce less bugs, right, or fewer bugs. The problem with these guidelines is, and some of these projects and companies they are very strict about this. So it's really, it costs also money, right? So the problem is that only rarely or almost in no case we have the situation that these guidelines are really based on empirical evidence. So if we look inside and look into the argumentation, it's lots about subjective experience and also plausibility arguments, right? So things like, yeah, that's obviously easier to understand if you do it this way. But actually we don't know, and they don't know, and nobody knows, right? And as it is about program comprehension, we need to measure it in order to support these guidelines. Another reason is that there's this never-ending debate on different kinds of programming languages, different kinds of programming paradigms, like functional programming in Haskell, for example, or imperative/object-oriented programming in Java. And that's there's typically, you can experience in academia and also in the private sector, lots of heated debated on, yeah, you should use Haskell because this and that, or you should use Java because this and that. And it's interesting to observe that many of these arguments, not all, are about comprehension. So you hear arguments like, so that resembles the real world better, right? Or it's closer to what the programmer has in mind, or to the mental model of the programmer. But actually we don't know. It's again just subjective experience. It's again just plausibility arguments, to a good extent. Another reason is that, I mean, the success of many of these major players in Silicon Valley and beyond is really that they were able to hire top people in programming and also other areas, right? And the question is, what is a top coder? Sometimes it's also called a 10xer, right? So what are these people doing differently from, say, normal programmers? What are their skills? Can we train normal programmers to become top coders, or is this somehow a genetic trait? We don't know. And for that, we need also to be able to measure program comprehensions to understand their strategies. And that also touches, of course, programming education, right? So there's also lots of work in that direction already, also empirical work, but it's still unclear whether you should, teach general computational thinking. You should teach in the beginning, especially to children, should teach concepts like recursion. Should you start with a visual programming language? And over the time, is it a goal to teach as many programming languages as possible for the people, for the students and children to understand what the common concepts are? Or is it maybe more optimal to specialize in a certain language, because then you are really good in this language? We don't know, and it's about measuring program comprehension in order to make progress. Okay, so I think we can agree now that measuring program comprehension is important, but how? And of course, people tried that before. So there's the idea of code complexity measures, right? The idea is to have code, and then you can measure that code structurally in some way. So you count things, you create certain representations and measure those, like the control flow graph and so on. And the idea is that these values that you compute, like the cyclomatic complexity, for example, tell you something about how hard that code is to comprehend, right? So complexity measures try to quantify the difficulty of comprehending this code. And I think most of us know that this more or less failed, right? So there are hundreds and hundreds of different metrics, and there's no unique or small set of metrics that can tell you that, even though it's still used in academia and still in practice, right? So that's obviously not a general way. What is done in these plausibility discussions, but also in research, is subjective assessment that works to a good extent, right? You could ask people, do you understand the program? And maybe also why? And then people say yes or no. But there have been studies also that show that people think they understand, say, a version in Haskell better than a version in Java, but other measures like their task performance tell a different story. Oh, there's also bias involved in this subjective assessment. So that's why people do this additional detour of creating comprehension tasks and, for example, ask, what is the output of such a program? And then you could check whether the people looking at Haskell programs, for example, are more correct in determining the output than others, or are faster, right? But there are many confounding factors, and I will get back to that point, right? It could be just by accident that the Haskell people are faster, right? Or they are more motivated, which is really not about Haskell, really, or not directly, or Java. Yeah? So it's an indirect measure. And in psychology, what people do a lot, that's mostly in the area of academia, so research studies, is you do think-aloud studies, right? So you show somebody code and then you ask them to spell out their thoughts, right? And then people walk you through the code and tell you, well, that is a list and something is added and removed. And by observing what they say, you get a better sense on why they are fast in solving that task, right? But there's also that problem that there's a certain bias involved, because people are reluctant to say things like, well, I see a pink elephant in the code, so maybe I should not say that aloud, and so on. There's bias as well. And the general problem of all these measurement methods is that either you you look at the task and the result. Yeah, you measure task performance, or you ask the developer or observe the developer. But the general problem for all of those is that there's so many confounding factors, right? So programming experience, knowledge of that specific programming language, cultural background has been observed, makes huge difference. The programming environment, the domain knowledge, the general intelligence, and so on. So question is, how can we close that gap? Because it's really hard to pin down why a certain result is observed. So why do these people take longer? And often the results are inconclusive. So that's really why there's no really breakthrough in program comprehension research, even though that area is there since the 70s, right? Okay, so the idea of this line of research I'm talking about, and I and my colleagues and my students, we were kind of pioneering that. Says we would like to use imaging techniques from neuroscience to close this gap, right? We would like to look inside into the human brain in order to close this gap. And that means that we do not mandate to throw all these other techniques away, but we propose an additional one. So you still measure task performance, you still ask the people and so on, right? So it's an addition. And the question is, the overarching question is, so which cognitive processes are involved in program comprehension, and can those help us to understand what is harder to comprehend and so on? Okay, so imaging techniques from neuroscience, I think most of you heard about that in the news and so on. So it's all about measuring brain activity. So for example, the brains of programmers. And there are two principal approaches. There's microimaging. That's recently people do that a lot. So measuring neural activity really at the level of individual neurons. And these techniques are typically invasive, right? And we cannot do that. The other way to do it is macroimaging. So here you focus on whole brain areas and cognitive load in general. And that's typically non-invasive. So specifically what we do is functional magnetic resonance imaging that has been developed in the 90s and since then evolved. And here are a couple of pictures that show more or less or give an impression how that works. So that's basically myself. So that's me in such a scanner, right? Measuring my brain activity. I have to say it's a bit scary. So that's myself from the inside, right? So you have this iron hat or mask, and it's a bit scary, but you're getting used to it, right? And then you get these pictures, right? That's also my brain and activity during a certain task, right? Just for illustration. So that's basically what fMRI is doing. So what is the principle? So what actually is measured? So the fMRI is basically measuring blood flow in the brain. And the hypothesis is, and that has been well researched in the last 30 years, is that activity leads to a higher consumption of oxygen, right? And that you can map this then to areas, right? If in a certain area there's higher activity, then more oxygen is consumed, and that's what fMRI can measure. So the amount of oxygen over time in a certain area, right? And that's called the Bolt response. There's a certain delay in it, right? And that's very important if you do experiments, but these are details. It's called the blood oxygen level dependent response. And that's what people do in fMRI, not only in our area, but there are thousands and thousands of studies using that. Okay, that's the idea. And so we would like to use it to mind read the programmers. So there's code, for example, code that is supposed to be simple according to a certain complexity metric, and code that is very complex according to that metric. And then we show it the programmer inside the scanner. So for example, myself. And then we get activation over time. And we map that to different areas in the brain that, based on the experience of, I don't know, 100 years of research in neuroscience, links it to certain cognitive processes. And then, of course, I have that feedback cycle. So where I, based on the results I get, create new hypotheses, measure again. So it's really the normal scientific cycle. So that's the idea. And that was our idea in 2010-11, right? And then we quickly, when we approached neuroscientists and started thinking about experiments, we quickly learned that's actually not so easy, right? So these pictures are very nice. They are very colorful. You see it sometimes in the news, but it's actually very complicated. So the first thing I learned, and it's clear in the end, but we were not aware of that, is the brain is always active, right? So if you put somebody in a scanner and show him or her this code, you will see activity. And because this person is alive, right? The question is, which part of that activity is really unique to program comprehension and not, you know, to processing sensory input or motion or whatever, right? So what you actually need is to apply the so-called subtraction method. So you need a control condition, which is in addition to the condition of doing program comprehension, right? So one condition is the task of program comprehension, and then we want to have a control task that is very similar to the program comprehension task, and it differs only. Can you hear me?
Sven, sorry, it seems I muted you. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, so
only 5 seconds.
Okay, right. So we want to have that control task that is as close as possible to the program comprehension task, but differs in the very act of program comprehension, right? And then the idea is that you, with in the end, heavy statistics, do the subtraction, and people do that in psychology as well, right? Not at this level of these data, but they do it. What remains is then really the activity that is specific to program comprehension. And one of the first contributions of our group, besides just the idea of doing this, right, is to find out what in our setting the control task is. So we cannot use control tasks from other fMRI research. So we experimented with a couple of different ways of doing control tasks, and we used different ones. Here's just one that was successfully replicated also by other groups and by ourselves. So here the idea is you show code, but you ask for spotting syntax errors, and everybody can try to find couple of syntax errors, and of course you need to know the language for that. And experience tells that it's actually even for large pieces of code very simple to spot syntax errors, and you do not need to understand the program. So that is a very simple program, and you could argue, well, it's just one look and then I see what's going on, but you have to imagine that you have larger code pieces, and being asked to spot the syntax errors, people are very fast and have no idea what the code is about. And there are certain problems with that, but we found that we get very accurate contrasts with that, and that was also replicated by a couple of groups worldwide. So that was a kind of first important step that we did. We actually did a couple of experiments, and our partner is the Leibniz Institute for Neurobiology in Magdeburg. Since 2012, where we did the first experiment, we did a series of experiments, basically, which are, so I do not show the pilot studies here and so on, just the actual experiments that have been published. And then we have that annoying break in 2020. So that's a kind of downside of this kind of research. that you rely on interaction with human beings. Yeah, so let's see what we can do in 2021 for further experiments. So just to give you an impression what you see, it's also simplified. If you're inside the scanner, right, you see basically the black screen. So you're lying in that scanner, and then we start. So the code that you see there is more complex, but here just for illustration, a comprehension task, you typically start with a couple of calibration tasks that are not really measured, right? So you're asked, so what is the output? And then you are forced into a rest condition, focusing on that cross. It's again like a few seconds. And then the syntax task. You are asked as fast as possible, identify the syntax errors. Rest condition, next comprehension task. Here's the first one that is really measured. What is the output? Rest condition, syntax, and so on. Okay, so once you have done that, the scanner and the IT machinery around the scanner is producing lots of data. And what we initially thought is that you get these nice pictures, right, that you see in the news and in the books. You get them out, and then you can start interpreting them. But that's not how it is really. First is always, and that was really new to me, always when you see these activation pictures, almost always you see an aggregated picture over multiple tasks and multiple participants. So for example, if you see such a picture, you see the activation of 10 participants doing a comprehension task on Haskell code, right? And somehow you need to aggregate that, and we will get back to that. That's the first thing. A prerequisite to arrive at the individual pictures that are the input for the aggregation is that you need to do motion correction, right? So it's if you're inside, you're actually not allowed to move, but people still do. And there's lots of techniques from statistics and information theory to do motion correction. But these are all sources of bias and so on. And you need to do it right. And you need to work with neuroscientists. That's very, for normal, I would say, computer scientists, that's very challenging. And then if you want to do aggregation, you have to understand the fact that anatomically, brains are very different across different people. You cannot just kind of superimpose or overlay them, right? So each of those different brains need to be transformed to a standard brain and to a standard coordinate system, which is called the Talailach coordinate system, right? And then you can do the aggregation. And that also needs to be done in the right way. And we closely collaborate with neuroscientists who are trained in this. So once you have done that, you get results like this one. So how do these results look, right? You get these nice pictures, but basically you get coordinates and cluster sizes, which show where activity was. And then you get automatically, based on these coordinates, numbers for the areas, right? These areas are called Brechmann areas. They are mapped to these standard brain coordinates, and they have numbers. And what you also get is then the number, so they are numbered to 1 to 60 or whatever. Actually, you get these functions over time. That's very important to understand. It's not just an activation, but the activation is dynamic, of course. So you really get these time series. Okay. And once you have that, then you can use this atlas of Brechmann areas, and then you need to understand what's going on there. So you need a mapping to the actual cognitive processes. And here you can and must rely on about 100 years of research on doing this mapping. And there are lots and lots and hundreds and thousands of papers that assign to these areas different cognitive processes and activities, which are then context dependent and so on. And there's even these nice websites where you can, look up these areas and relate them to cognitive processes. now maybe in that second part, what are our key results of applying that methodology, right? And I would like to highlight here, I mean, using that method, you get lots and lots of results, which are very specific. Here I summarize just for you the key results. So the first observation, which was especially surprising to our neuroscientist in the team, and I will later show a picture of him, is that we found a pretty pronounced left dominant activation of program comprehension, right? So that's a neurobiological correlate of program comprehension, and it's left dominant. And that means that program comprehension is very related to language processing, right? And while I mean, I told that story before, and people are not super surprised about this. I say programming language, natural language, it's both languages, right? The interesting thing is that there has been a debate in the 60s and 70s. So how important language, natural language skills are for programmers and computer scientists in general. And Dijkstra was a great proponent of, he was even saying, so in training programmers and computer scientists, we need to train them in language skills. And we all know that, say, the population of computer science students and maybe programmers in general, they're not, who are not studying computer science, but maybe are trained in programming, they're not the best in language skills, right? And that's, in a sense, support for that hypothesis. And here's an interesting side, because at this time, many people said, well, let's focus entirely on mathematics, logic, algebra, and so on. And he was saying, no, we also need to teach language skills. And here is support for this. That's a very interesting side story, which seems to be supported by our data. So the state of Kentucky, and in the meantime also other US states, decided that instead of learning a foreign language, foreign natural language, students in school, in high school, can also learn a programming language. And it seems to kind of be supported by our results, but actually we're not fans of this, right? Because learning a foreign natural language is not just about developing language skills, it is about also learning a different culture, amongst others, right? But that's just a side story. So further key result is that we were able to measure the difference between top-down and bottom-up comprehension. So these are two models of program comprehensions that have been developed in the 70s and the 80s. So I make it quick. So in top-down comprehension, it is assumed that programmers look for so-called semantic cues, like variable names, here reverse words, and get an initial hypothesis on what the code is doing, right? So here, if I look at this code and I see reverse word or quick sort, I immediately form an hypothesis and then just go through the code and validate it. I go from top to down, right? And if you don't have semantic cues or other so-called beacons or other kinds of information, then, well, you cannot use that strategy. Then you need to go through the program statement by statement and chunk them and build up your understanding of the code, which is then called bottom-up comprehension. And it was hypothesized that top-down comprehension is, on the one hand, more efficient, and on the second hand, it is used more by experienced programmers, right? And we really wanted to check that hypothesis and to check the results that have been found with other methods. And actually, we found lots of activation. What is actually important here is this bar diagram. Maybe I can use the laser pointer, right? Where we compare the bold responses in percent between top-down comprehension. So that means that were the programmers that looked at code that enabled top-down comprehension. So that was code with semantic cues, proper identifiers of variables and so on, as compared to the activation of programmers who were not able to use top-down comprehension, as we have seen on the right side. And you see here that the cognitive load and the neural activity was lower, so which is an indicator that top-down comprehension is really consuming less and less cognitive resources. So the cognitive load is lower. So we can really confirm this hypothesis. And it's really maybe also not too surprising, but here you can see how we close the gap, right? So if you observe like 50 programmers on these top-down snippets and 50 programmers on these bottom-up snippets, and you see a difference in a noisy difference in the task completion time, then actually you don't know really, is that really due to experience or just accidents? But here with that diagram, we really can see that the cognitive load for the top-down ones was lower, significantly lower, right? Where we'll get back to this example. Another key result is about these code complexity metrics, right? So is it really, because sometimes there are results saying, well, there are some code complexity metrics that hint at the actual code complexity in terms of how difficult the code is to understand, and sometimes not. So what we did is we looked at very simple code complexity metrics. Simplest one is lines of code or lines, number of statements or whatever, and at two classes that are more complicated. So one is one idea is to create a program representation that that shows the control flow. So which statements may follow which other statements, and then you measure something in that control flow graph. And if there are many cycles or many dependencies or many out or ingoing edges, there are different metrics, then that's bad, right? So that's the idea of control flow based complexity metrics. And more recently, people thought, well, it's not only about, so the complexity of a program is not only about control flow, it's also about data flow. So if you have many data dependencies, which is not necessarily accompanied with complex control flow, then this is also complicated. And metrics have been proposed with all these plausibility arguments. And yeah, we checked this, and that's very interesting. We found that control flow metrics do not predict cognitive load, right? But interestingly, these novel data flow-based complexity metrics, they predict cognitive load, which is a very interesting sign that these data flow metrics really capture something about the complexity of the code. And of course, you need replication studies and so on, but we found that very interesting. And we looked at many other complexity metrics and confirmed that basically most of them are not indicative of the complexity of the code. Well, that's how it is. Then we looked at, or that's basically this key result. I have to say, it's really ongoing work. So it's really an initial key result, if you want. So we looked at programming experience, right? So the idea was experienced programmers first use different areas to activate different areas in the brain. And that's based on what has been observed when comparing expert golfers versus novice golfers, or expert mathematicians versus novice mathematicians, and so on. So that was the high idea. And actually, we could not, in terms of cognitive load, we could not confirm this hypothesis, right? So something else is going on. So it's not per se the cognitive load which distinguishes top coders from novices, at least not in our setting. And what we found, but we did not reach the required level of statistical significance yet. And that's why we want to do more experiments, but then there was COVID and so on. What we found in initial results is that top coders seem to use Broca's area more intensively and more pronounced than novice programmers. And Broca's area is a very central area for speech processing and language processing. Right, but we need a dedicated study for this, and that's actually the next study we plan, which is now delayed, hopefully only to 21. And finally, and that's I don't know if that's the most exciting result, but I think it's the most important result. The most important result is that our setup and our results have been replicated by ourselves and by several other groups in the world multiple times, right? And I think in this kind of research, that's imperative. And I think that that's really what will stay, right? And with regard to these individual results, whether a certain metric correlates better or whatever, that can change with more experiments, right? But the methodology is important, and I did not talk too much about this here, but we are really, since 10 years, we are really puzzled about many details on the methodology, how you select tasks, control conditions, and so on. Yeah. So that is, I think, to me, the main success. Okay, so where do we go from now, right? So we as a group or as a community. First is, at the moment, we and others work on actually a multimodal approach. So fMRI is cool, it's some nerd stuff, but it has its weaknesses, right? So actually you have a very low temporal resolution only. And that's better with EEG and fNIRS, and there's behavioral measures like eye tracking. All these are interesting sources of information, what the programmer is doing and thinking, right? And we would like to combine them to get a better understanding what's going on. And I will show an example. First of all, we have even tooling already. So that's also a kind of technical issue. So you have signals with different properties, different levels of noise, different sampling rates and whatever, and you need to integrate that and in a way that you can make sense of what people did and experienced, right? So we have the tool coders muse, which here shows, for example, the trajectory of here on the left side, you see that of the gaze of the programmer going through the code. And then you see on the right side physiological data, which are also interesting, like pupil dilation. And then you see for BA6, the time series, and at the bottom you see some activation from the brain, right? And you would like to explore it, and the most important thing in the end is the slider on the bottom, right? Where you can go retrospectively through time and see how that changed over the course of the experiment, right? And that's really new stuff in a sense. And we are really working on this and trying to demonstrate how this multimodal approach really even improves over what has been done so far. There were also some technical challenges. It's actually not so easy to combine those. Here is a schematic overview how we did that for fMRI and eye tracking. Point is, you cannot put the eye tracker inside the scanner, right? So the normal scanner works as follows. You have your screen, which is fed by a projector, and then there's a mirror where, you know, that lets the participants see what is on the screen. And now the question is where to put the eye tracker. And then with the help of neuroscientists and technicians at the Leibniz Institute, it looks quite simple now, but it is technically very challenging because these eye trackers are very sensitive. And then you have both on the same mirror and so on. And there was even a publication of a colleague of mine with neuroscientists really publishing this setup in a neuroscience journal, which is really was for the first time that in this way these two were combined. And the good for us was that we could use it. And here it's the last example we will see. An example which illustrates the power of a multimodal approach. So let's get back to that idea of top-down and bottom-up comprehension. The left version has meaningful identifiers. Idea is that this facilitates top-down comprehension, and the right one is with meaningless identifiers, which forces people to do bottom-up comprehension, right? And so that's basically the time series or timeline, the function over time compared for the meaningful and meaningless. So that's meaningful and meaningless identifiers for BA21. You see that also for other brain areas. And you see a difference here, which is statistically significant and also substantial in terms of effect size. And previously I said, well, that indicates that there's a different activity and different cognitive load for the top-down approach. But now actually the hypothesis is more complicated. We are not just saying that the hypothesis is that top-down reduces cognitive load, but we are saying Top-down is doing that because the identifiers are meaningful. And just looking at this difference, we don't know, right? It could be something else. And now, as we repeated that experiment with an eye tracker simultaneously, we could confirm that the gaze of the programmer was mostly on the identifiers, right? This is an additional piece of information. So that suggests that it was really the presence of the identifiers, and of course we had longer code snippets, more complicated code snippets, that was really made the difference. And that, to me, illustrates very nicely the power of a multimodal approach. Yeah, and in further steps, we're already connected with psychologists from here, Saarland University, who have an EEG lab and so on. And there's many things are possible. Okay, just a few final words. What are the big questions we would like to answer in the future, right? So first is, so which program constructs and idioms, patterns cause confusion and errors? There's a whole body of research on code smells, coding guidelines, atoms of confusion. There's debate in programming language design. Should we express it this way or that way? And I think with that methodology, we can contribute to the discussion. Of course, it's not the silver bullet. It's never the silver bullet, but it's a new methodology which can contribute to answer this question. Important question: what makes a programmer excellent? What skills do programmers use? Is it language processing? What is it, right? And it has implications for training, of course, which is the second point, the third point. How should we teach programming? Which tools, which languages, objects first, functions first. Many programming languages, just one, visual, textual. Actually, we don't know. That does not mean that there are no results, but there are so many contradictory results that we hope that with that methodology we can contribute. It's again, we do not want to say that all of that is garbage. No, there's lots of important results, and we bring in a new method that may help to resolve some conflicts we observe. Which skills should programmers have? Could be that in the end it's general intelligence and not language skills. Also our results at the moment point at language skills. Or is it domain knowledge, right? Or what is it? Specific programming language knowledge, computational thinking, general problem solving strategies. What are the skills that help programmers? And that's super important to know. And yeah, of course, can we improve programming languages and tools? Because most design decisions in that space are not based on hard empirical evidence. So that's the core team in alphabetical order. So we work in this composition for about 10 years together, and there are, of course, further contributors. If you're interested in that area, there are many detailed results. You can look into papers which are on my website, but of course you can also talk to me. And that's it. Holger, are you still with us?
Amazingly, I'm still with you. Yeah.
Oh, very good.
No, fascinating. Thanks a lot, Sven, for this great presentation. I do invite question. I see the first hands raising. Maybe we start with the one of Joel.
Thanks, Sven. Absolutely fascinating talk. As I was listening to you, I mean, programming is something I've not done for a long time, but I've been involved in other sort of cognitive activities, in particular, learning some areas of mathematics and so on. And it just seems that some areas are just a lot easier for certain people than others. So some people are better suited for, say, analysis, and some people for algebra. And it doesn't seem clear to me what makes one particular brain seemingly better adept at learning than another. Are there lessons from your work that would give pointers to what makes it that particular, say in the context of programming perhaps, or there are certain things that are easier for certain brains to learn and for other brains to learn, even though the two people seem equally intelligent and so on?
Yeah, so not yet. So actually the problem of this kind of research is, and when you look at general results in that area. So what do intelligent people do, and so on. So you need actually very many studies. So at the moment we cannot help with that question. I think a question our neuroscientists in the team are very interested in is whether, I mean, they talk about often they're interested in very fundamental skills. So logic, mathematics, reading, language comprehension, emotional intelligence, whatever. And here a question they have, and that I find it very interesting, is whether programming and computational thinking is something else at a very fundamental level, or is it just a composition of math/logic plus language? And that's not clear at the moment, but that's really a fundamental question that we have at this intersection, which needs many studies, I fear. So it sounds at the moment that, and we made lots of progress, I think, that we will keep up with this pace. But actually now we are at the stage where you need to replicate and test and root in the literature. And our group cannot solve that. The good thing is that there are about like 4 or 5 groups in the world that followed our footsteps doing this. And in the last 2 years, we see increasingly papers also in neuroscience venues. Yeah? So we kind of focused on computer science venues, publishing that work, but there are more and more papers in neuroscience venues looking at this and even citing us, which is that is interesting because it's across disciplines, right? Yeah, but I fear I cannot answer this.
All right. Thanks a lot. Hans-Peter?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for the talk. I have two questions. My first question is, how would you possibly program inside an fMRI? So, I mean, I can understand that you can do program comprehension. I mean, you explained to us in one of the last slides sort of what the technical setup is. So you have the screen, you read the code, and you can measure how to comprehend it. But if you want to actually program, so presumably this is then other modalities. But that's my first question. My second question is there any fMRI installation on the campus, say in Hamburg? And are there any people, is there any neuroscience group locally that one could also cooperate with in the abstract?
Yes, yeah, thanks for the questions. First question is, of course, you can only do program reading and comprehension in the fMRI. It will be very difficult to do programming really, which is closed. So in this sense, it's really fundamental research. And I mean, that's always the hardest argument if you go to, say, programming and software engineering venues. They're always kind of criticizing that if I'm a Linux kernel programmer, I look at millions of lines of code and so on, and you cannot really resemble this. And that's fine. We are really at the beginning and try to maximize internal validity as compared to external validity. But it will never really work to have a keyboard or something that you can really use.
Other modalities, for example, EEG or?
Yeah. So with EEG and fNIRS, fNIRS is basically so EEG is really measuring the electromagnetic field, right? So it's this temporarily very high resolution, but spatially not. And fNIRS is basically measuring the same effect as fMRI, and it's just a HUD or a cap. It's of course not so powerful, but that's also what one other group already did with programming. But yeah. It's difficult because even if you use those modalities, you have to have very good control conditions, right? Because motion is there, right? Because you're striking keys. But that's certainly an important step. At the moment, we are not there yet. We're not really focusing on producing code. Yeah, but then you need to use other modalities. Second question is, so we started, so that's actually an initiative from the Corporate Research Center, CPEC, right? And Holger knows about this. So there's the idea that we involve psychologists also in general, or there's the idea maybe whether that makes sense. We will see. And then I approached two persons, that's Jutta Kai and Axel Mecklinger. They are psychologists, right? And they have an EEG lab. And they are super interested in that topic. And Axel is, for example, also an expert in language comprehension. Yeah. So really from the psychology. And Axel is very close to neuroscience. I think he told me that's he was the first in the psychology department who said there's a neurological basis for what you're, researching here. And he already did fMRI studies on...
Which would be in line with Chomsky, right?
Yeah.
In a sense.
In a sense, yes. He already did fMRI studies with Hamburg. Yeah. So that's possible. He has contacts. We are planning this. At the moment, it's a bit difficult, but that was also when I kind of had this hiring interview here. I was also asking Holger, do they have a scanner and so on? And he said yes. That's definitely a way to go. So we start with EEG now because it's on campus, the lab, and the fMRI scanner or scanners are in Hamburg. We will always work with the Leibniz Institute still. So the good thing is that we have now two pillars. The good thing about the Leibniz one is just the detail, is that's purely a research scanner. And in Hamburg, it's a shared research medical scanner. Yeah, and the problem is that you know what the precedence then is. So the medical treatments and imaging tasks have precedence. Yeah, but definitely. So it's really now. I even hired a PhD student to work closer with Axel and Jutta, and also it's underway.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks a lot. I have a question from Andre.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. So what I like understand of language processing in the brain is that Broca and Wernicke's areas are like the main centers. I mean, as for my shallow understanding, and Broca is for producing, but Wernicke is for understanding. But I think in your work, I saw that Broca showed up, which is for production, even though you were doing a comprehension task, but Wernicke wasn't showing up, which normally would be for comprehension.
So which one is Wernicke, which BA? So sorry, I'm not really trained neuroscientist.
I mean,
so
I also have
Broca is 45, 44, 45. Yeah, actually there are more, right? So I have also these notes here. So actually there are more areas for different kinds of. So it's not just, so that's what typically is known in the popular science literature. You have Broca and Wernicke, but there are more which are doing different responsibilities. So areas for syntactic processing at the word level. Then there are areas for semantic integration of language information, for grammar and so on. So there's more than that. But yeah, so that's what we found. We found Broca and not Wernicke. And it's still, I mean, our neuroscientist is always very, it is very important for him to say that we not say when we go outside, like in this talk here, we're not say that programming comprehension is language processing. It is showing the same neuroactivity, and it's with that very related to this. And yeah. So that's all I can say at the moment, and it's yeah, you're right. So I cannot say why. So I will ask the neuroscientists, but they were not surprised by this in a sense. So they're saying that you see that often even in non-production tasks that they are active, and that you have always these hundreds of papers observing this and that. So that was not a problem for them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that answers my question.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have one more question from Pia.
Yes, hi, I hope you can hear me. So yeah, I'm a student in computational linguistics. So thanks for the nice talk. So I was always wondering about the connection between programming languages and natural languages. So you've given credits to neuroscientists and also psychologists, but have you also talked to the linguists here at Saarland University? Because I know that they are doing, for instance, EEG experiments and everything. And I was wondering about whether, for instance, for EEG, the same peaks that you see for natural language reading comprehension for certain like irregularities, like semantic or syntactic irregularities, whether you would see the same peaks basically when reading any syntactic errors or semantic irregularities in programs?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a whole set of answers. First, we talked, of course, to the computer linguists in the computer linguist departments, also not the pure linguists, but the computer linguists. There are some interesting connections, Vera, for example, on surprise, right? So surprise is a very important concept in these models. And there has been a study recently on relating this result of surprise and difficulty to comprehend a piece of code to that research, but not in using a measurement brain measurement method yet. But that's what we definitely want to do, especially with Jutta and Axel, who have then, so it's kind of indirect yet, who have direct contact to the linguistics people and worked with them. So, but yeah, definitely, it's definitely true, but it's, yeah, so I'm really doing my best to connect to many people, but at the moment it's still indirect. But I know about a couple of results in the area of linguistics that are very related. So it's about yeah, distance of dependencies that appears very related to data flow metrics on code complexity and so on, and intuitively makes sense for programs, and surprisal. And there may be more. Yeah, but that's a good point.
Yeah, thanks. I have another question. So, because I feel like when I read programs, it's of course similar to reading natural language, but at the same time, there are other processes going on that are different from reading, let's say, a newspaper text, for instance, that I kind of, like some say, they emulate the computer inside their brain because they have to keep in mind, like, what are the variables, like what things I need to store in memory. And I feel like there's not a direct analogy to language processing because you don't have to keep in mind like where what are the values that are currently stored in counter variables or the like. So do you see like any connections to other tasks? So what is different from reading comprehension for natural language compared to
I mean, that's actually it's makes not much sense to talk about the act of reading, right? So it really depends on what you read, of course. And there are technical texts and very shallow texts and so on. But this relation to that you need to store information to make sense of the sentence that come. You have that. You have these relation words, right? He, she, and depending on the complexity of the text, it's then for certain people very difficult to understand what it and he refers to. So you need to make sense of this and to need to store this, right? And of course, many texts like in newspapers are not so complicated. So that's for one, right? So that would be interesting to see if you have challenging texts, and in linguistics, people have those texts and thought about the distances of these relative words and so on to relate that, what that means to distances of variable values, right? So between definition and use and so on. The other thing is, of course, at the causa grain, you have relations as well. So you introduce information and facts and that you use later. And that starts with abbreviations and with numbers and with relations. You have that too. But maybe it's too simple to say that reading a programming language is like reading a text, because there are so many different texts. And then the typical program is very complicated. So we need to compare it to a complicated text. So for example, a Prüfungsordnung or some law texts, legal texts. There are many cross-references. There are many things to keep in mind. So what was the applicant, right? And then that's defined somewhere else. But that's now in this text, 50 pages later, it's important. Who is the applicant? Is it this guy? Is it the external ones, the internal ones, and so on? So there's a relation, and there's a whole set. I mean, there's lots of PhD students in a sense in, right? Or PhD thesis in to do that. But there's, I think, a strong relation you could explore.
Yeah, I think it's known as co-reference resolution and pronoun resolution in linguists. So yeah, but I've never thought about it like that when I read programs. So thanks for the connection and thanks for your talk again.
Thank you.
All right. I have two more questions here that we may want to take. Zamal is the first.
So one question that I have is, how were the participants different in their language proficiencies? Were they controlled for that?
Yeah, so that's a whole kind of science if you want to check for interpersonal variance, right? And there's always this trade-off between internal and external validity, right? So what you typically do when you start with such an area, you increase internal validity, which means that you would like to have a homogeneous group. That means that you have questionnaires in the beginning. So how much programming experience, where you come from, what is your mother tongue, are you left-handed or right-handed, and so on. So we have even papers published on what to ask, right? So yeah, we try to control for this, but we did not do standard language skill tests. Yeah, and the question is always, is this maybe a control variable, or is it a independent variable? Yeah, so I can imagine, and that's actually what we plan with Axel, right? So we would like to do before after studies. Yeah, so you start with a population which is hopefully as homogeneous as it gets, and then you train people different things, right? Different language skills. That's the only way you can really measure it and control it, right? You hopefully you have a homogeneous population, and then you give some training in Java, some training in computational thinking, concepts, recursion, I don't know, control flow graphs, dependencies, whatever, maybe on a formal level, and some in mathematics, basic like algebra, I don't know, and some in language skills. And there's also different ways. And then you'll look afterwards, right? And these before-after studies are very popular because the brain structure even is very dynamic. It really changes. You should see a difference. The question is, how is it then related to the capability of understand programs? That's completely unclear. And that's what we would like to do here, basically, with Axel.
Okay. So another question that I have is the control test that you had, in which one was just the language comprehension, which was your main task, and the other one was syntax error. So, but if you take the difference, then would it not be the syntax error that you are actually measuring?
You're not measuring the syntax error. You're measuring the process of going through the code and identify the syntax error, which is different. If you think about that, there are of course threats of validity, but which is different of determining what the output of the program is, right? But we have also simpler tasks, like for example, counting all opening brackets, and you're still moving your eyes, you're still going through the code, but it's really you're really not understanding the code. Yeah.
So when you are doing the syntax error task, you are at the same time comprehending the code as well, right?
That's right, but you can, yeah, that's a threat to validity. That's why we also use other tasks, but you can measure how long they take, right? So that's all a question of setup. So if a piece of code, say like a complicated one, I don't know, like some interesting sorting algorithm like heap sort or something, you put it in bottom-up comprehension. So all is called foo and bar. And then you say, well, find the syntax errors. And then you see it from the response time, whether they try to understand the code or not. And you need to correct for this, right? Because nobody can understand it in a second, but they can find the syntax error in a fraction of a second.
All right. Dimitri, you want to pose your question?
Yes, hello. My question is, you investigated how the static or strong typing influence the comprehension in programming.
So can you say it again?
Static typing. So, for example, in Python, you can program without using a static typing.
Okay, yeah, that's right. So I mean, so we did not do that. But there's a nice blueprint. So Stefan Hahnenberg, Duisburg-Essen, with people from, I don't know where, college, Mary and William, they did observational studies on the influence of having static typing information, right? And they found that it helps a lot, but we did not do it in this context. But there's a good set of papers which you could take as starting points.
Okay, Stefan Hahnenberg?
Stefan Hahnenberg, so
Hahnenberg.
yes, Hahnenberg, Duisburg-Essen. There's a couple of papers on that without brain imaging, but really saying, well, here's the same program with static type information and not. What is the influence for program comprehension? What is the influence for introducing bugs and so on? And then there are many confounding factors as well. And that's what he writes about.
Okay, thank you. It was very interesting.
All right, Sven, thanks a lot. Here is a last question. So what do you think, how far away are we from a time where we will all have our brain scanned while we are doing talk comprehension of a presentation of yours?
Yeah, first of all, you need superconductivity, right? The point is that in order to look inside your brain, you need strong magnetic fields. Mm-hmm. And that's why you need this big scanner, right? Mm-hmm. But if you have room temperature superconductivity, you can have a very small device. And then you can do it. And then at least you can observe activity. And when I see, for example, so I can see, so I have my dashboard, I give the talk, I have my dashboard and see, Holger, there's not much cognitive loads. And I can come up with extra slides and kind of give you more beef.
Okay.
But of course, that's just kidding. I don't think that fMRI is really, but you never know. The Human Brain Project is very interesting, but it's at the moment, I think, and I'm an outsider, so not a neuroscientist or anything. At the moment, it's not really delivering on its promises for people who know what the Human Brain Project is. It's one of the two flagship projects of the ERC. So I think it will take some time really to decode that.
All right, understood. Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Very, very interesting. Well spent time. Sorry for cutting your voice for some seconds. Thanks again.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and see you around, everybody.
Thanks, Sven. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.